What is feminism? According to Wikipedia, feminism is a range of social movements and ideologies that aim to define and establish the political, economic, personal, and social equality of the sexes. Feminism incorporates the position that societies prioritize the male point of view and that women are treated unjustly within those societies. Efforts to change that include fighting against gender stereotypes and establishing educational, professional, and interpersonal opportunities and outcomes for women that are equal to those for men. Feminist movements have campaigned and continue to campaign for women's rights, including the right to vote, hold public office, work, earn equal pay, own property, receive education, enter contracts, have equal rights within marriage, and maternity leave. Feminists have also worked to ensure access to legal abortions and social integration, and to protect women and girls from rape, sexual harassment, and domestic violence. Changes in female dress standards and acceptable physical activities for females have often been part of the feminist movements. Some scholars consider feminist campaigns to be the main force behind major societal changes for women's rights, particularly in the West, where they are near universally credited with achieving women's suffrage, gender-neutral language, reproductive rights for women, including access to contraceptives, abortion, and the right to enter into contracts and own property. Although feminist advocacy is and has been mainly focused on women's rights, some feminists argue for the inclusion of men's liberation within its aims, because they believe that men are also harmed by traditional gender roles. Feminist theory, which emerged from feminist movements, aims to understand the nature of gender inequality by examining women's social roles and lived existence. Feminist theorists have developed theories in a variety of disciplines in order to respond to issues concerning gender. Numerous feminist movements and ideologies have developed over the years and represent different viewpoints and aims. Traditionally, the 19th century first wave feminism that sought political and legal equality through reforms within a liberal democratic framework was contrasted with labor-based proletarian movements of women's movements that developed over time into socialist and Marxist feminism based on the class struggle theory. Sorry, my glasses. Since the 1960s, both of these traditions are also contrasted with radical feminism that arose from the radical wing of second-wave feminism and that calls for a radical reordering of society to eliminate male supremacy. Together, liberal, socialist, and radical feminism are sometimes called the big three schools of feminist thought. Since the late 20th century, many newer forms of feminism have emerged. Some forms of feminism have been criticized for taking into account only white, middle-class, college-educated, heterosexual, or cisgender perspectives. These criticisms have led to the creation of ethnically specific or multicultural forms of feminism, such as black feminism and intersectional feminism. History. Terminology. Charles Fourier, a utopian socialist and French philosopher, is credited with having coined the word feminisme in 1837. The words feminisme, or feminism in English, or feministe or feminist, first appeared in France and the Netherlands in 1872, Great Britain in the 1890s, and the United States in 1910. The Oxford English Dictionary lists 1852 as the year of the first appearance of feminist, and 1895 for feminism. Depending on the historical moment, culture, and country, feminists around the world have had different causes and goals. Most Western feminist historians contend that all movements working to obtain women's rights should be considered feminist movements, even while they did not or do not apply the term to themselves. Other historians assert that the term should be limited to the modern feminist movement and its descendants. Those historians use the label proto-feminist to describe earlier movements. Waves. The history of the modern feminist movement is divided into 4 waves. The first is comprised of women's suffrage movements of the 19th and early 20th century, promoting women's right to vote. The second wave, the women's liberation movement, began in the 1960s and campaigned for legal and social equality for women. In or around 1992, a third wave was identified, characterized by a focus on individuality and diversity. The fourth wave, from around 2012, used social media to combat sexual harassment, violence against women, and rape culture. It is best known for the Metoo Movement. 19th and early 20th centuries. First wave feminism was a period of activity during the 19th and early 20th centuries. In the United States and the U.S., it focused on the promotion of equal contract, marriage, parenting, and property rights for women. New legislation included the Custody of Infants Act of 1839 in the UK, which introduced the tender years doctrine for child custody and gave women the right of custody of their children for the first time. Other legislation, such as the Married Women's Property Act of 1870 in the UK and extended into the 1882 Act, became models for similar legislation in other British territories. Victoria passed legislation in 1884 and New South Wales in 1889. The remaining Australian colonies passed similar legislation between 1890 and 1897. With the turn of the 19th century, activism focused primarily on gaining political power, particularly the right of women's suffrage. Though some feminists were active in campaigning for women's sexual, reproductive, and economic rights too. Women's suffrage, the right to vote and stand for parliamentary office, began in Britain's Australasian colonies at the close of the 19th century, with the self-governing colonies of New Zealand granting women the right to vote in 1893. South Australia followed suit with the constitutional amendment, Adult Suffrage Act of 1894. This was followed by Australia granting female suffrage in 1902. In Britain, the suffragettes and the suffragists campaigned for the women's vote, and in 1918, the Representation of the People Act was passed, granting the vote to people over the age of 30 who owned property. In 1928, this was extended to all women over 21. Emmeline Pankhurst was the most notable activist in England. Time named her one of the 100 most important people of the 20th century, stating she shaped an idea of women for our time. She shook society into a new pattern from which there would be no going back. In the U.S., notable leaders of this movement included Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, who each campaigned for the abolition of slavery before championing women's right to vote. These women were influenced by the Quaker theory of spiritual equality, which asserts that men and women are equal under God. In the U.S., first-wave feminism is considered to have ended with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1919, granting women the right to vote in all states. The first wave was coined retroactively when the second wave feminism came into use. During the late Qing period and reform movements such as the 100 Days Reform, Chinese feminists called for women's liberation from traditional roles and Neo-Confucian gender segregation. Later, the Chinese Communist Party created projects aimed at integrating women into the workforce and claimed that the revolution had successfully achieved women's liberation. According to Nawar al-Hassan Gholi, Arab feminism was closely connected with Arab nationalism. In 1899, Qasim Amin, considered the father of Arab feminism, wrote The Liberation of Women, which argued for legal and social reforms for women. He drew links between women's position in Egyptian society and nationalism, leading to the development of Cairo University and the national movement. In 1923, Hoda Sharawi founded the Egyptian Feminist Union, became its president and a symbol of the Arab women's rights movement. The Iranian Constitutional Revolution of 1805 triggered the Iranian women's movement, which aimed to achieve women's equality in education, marriage, careers, and legal rights. However, during the Iranian Revolution of 1979, many of the rights that women had gained from the women's movement were systematically abolished, such as the Family Protection Law. In France, women obtained the right to vote only with the Provisional Government of the French Republic in April 21st, 1944. The Consultative Assembly of Algiers in 1944 proposed March 24th, 1944 to grant eligibility to women, but following an amendment by Fernand Grenier, they were given full citizenship, including the right to vote. Grenier's proposition was adopted 51-16. In May 1947, following the November 1946 elections, the sociologist Robert Verdier minimized the gender gap, stating in La Populaire that women had not voted in a consistent way, dividing themselves as men according to social classes. During the baby boom period, feminism waned in importance. Wars, both in World War I and World War II, had seen the provisional emancipation of some women. The post-war period signaled the return to conservative rules. By the way, this is Wikipedia. I don't think this is accurate. I'm just reading Wikipedia. Half this stuff might be incorrect, but I'm just trying to say what's on Wikipedia currently. So some of this I think it might be a little bit off, but parts of it are true, so it'd be interesting to some people. I don't know. Mid-20th century. By the mid-20th century, women still lacked significant rights. In Switzerland, women gained the right to vote in federal elections in 1971, but the canton of Appenzell Innerrhoden women obtained the right to vote on local issues only in 1991, when the canton was forced to do so by the Federal Supreme Court of Switzerland. In Liechtenstein, women were given the right to vote by the women's suffrage referendum of 1984. 3 prior referendums held in 1968, 1971, 1973 had failed to secure women's right to vote. Feminists continued to campaign for reform of family laws, which gave husbands control over their wives. Although by the 20th century, coverture had been abolished in the UK and the US, in many continental European countries, married women still had very few rights. For instance, in France, married women did not receive the right to work without their husband's permission until 1965. Feminists have also worked to abolish the marital exemption in rape laws, which precluded the prosecution of husbands for the rape of their wives. Earlier efforts by first-wave feminists such as the Voltairian de Cleyre, Victoria Woodhull, and Elizabeth Clark Wolstenholme Elmy to criminalize marital rape in the late 19th century had failed. This was only achieved a century later in most Western countries, but is still not achieved in many parts of the world. French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir provided a Marxist solution and an existential view on many of the questions of feminism within the publication of Le Deuxième Sexe, in English is The Second Sex, in 1949. The book expressed feminist sense of injustice. Second-wave feminism is a feminist movement beginning in the early 1960s and continuing to the present. As such, it coexists with third-wave feminism. Second-wave feminism is largely concerned with the issues of equality beyond suffrage, such as ending gender discrimination. Second-wave feminists see women's cultural and political inequalities as inexorably linked and encourage women to understand aspects of their personal lives as deeply politicized and as reflecting sexist power structures. The feminist activist and author Carl Hennix coined the slogan, "The personal is political," which became synonymous with the second wave. Second and third wave feminism in China had been characterized by a re-examination of women's roles during the Communist Revolution and other political movements, and the new discussions about whether women's equality had actually been fully achieved. In 1956, President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt initiated state feminism, which outlawed discrimination based on gender and granted women suffrage. but also blocked political activism by feminist leaders. During Sadat's presidency, his wife, Jahan Sadat, publicly advocated further women's rights. Though Egyptian policy and society began to move away from women's equality and the new Islamist movement, and the growing conservatism. However, some activists proposed new feminist movement, Islamic feminism, which argues for women's equality within the Islamic framework. In Latin America, revolutions brought changes in women's status in countries such as Nicaragua, where feminist ideology during the Sandinista revolution aided women's quality in life, but fell short of achieving social and ideological change. In 1963, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, helped voice the disconnect that American women felt. The book is widely credited with sparking the beginning of second-wave feminism in the United States. Within 10 years, women made up over half of the first world workforce. Late 20th and early 21st centuries. Third-wave feminism. Third-wave feminism is traced to the emergence of the riot girl, feminist, punk subculture in Olympia, Washington in the early 1990s, and to Anita Hill's televised testimony in 1991 to an all-male, all-white Senate Judiciary Committee that Terrence Thomas, nominated for the Supreme Court of the United States, had sexually assaulted her. The term third wave is credited to Rebecca Walker, who responded to Thomas's appointment to the Supreme Court with an article in Miss Magazine. Becoming third wave, she wrote, 1992. So I write this as a plea to all women, especially women of my generation. Let Thomas's confirmation serve to remind you, as it did me, that the fight is far from over. Let the dismissal of women's experience move you to anger. Turn that outrage into political power. Do not vote for them unless they work for us. Do not have sex with them. Do not break bread with them. Do not nurture them if they don't prioritize our freedom to control our bodies and our lives. I am not a post-feminism feminist. I am the third wave. Third wave feminism also sought to challenge or avoid what deemed the second wave's existentialist definition of femininity, which third wave feminists argued overemphasized the experiences of the upper middle class white women. Third wave feminists often focused on micropolitics and challenged the second wave's paradigm as to what was or was not good for women, and tended to use post-structuralist interpretation of gender and sexuality. Feminist leaders rooted in the second wave, such as Gloria Anzaldúa, Bell Hooks, Chela Sandoval, Cherry Moraja, Audre Lorde, Maxine Hong Kingston, and many other non-white feminists sought to negotiate a space within the feminist thought for consideration of race-related subjectivities. Third-wave feminism also contained internal debates between difference feminists, who believe that there are important psychological differences between the sexes, and those who believe that there are no inherent psychological differences between the sexes and contend that the gender roles are due to social conditioning. Standpoint theory. Standpoint theory is a feminist theological point of view stating that a person's social position influences their knowledge. This perspective argues that research and theory treat women and the feminist movement as insignificant and refuses to see traditional science as unbiased. Since the 1980s, standpoint feminists have argued that the feminist movement should address global issues such as rape, incest, and prostitution, and culturally specific issues such as female genital mutilation in some parts of Africa and Arab societies, as well as glass ceiling practices that impede women's advancement in developing economies. In order to understand how gender inequality interacts with racism, homophobia, classism, and colonization in a matrix of domination. Fourth wave feminism. Fourth wave feminism refers to a resurgence of interest in feminism that began around 2012 and is associated with the use of social media. According to feminist scholar Prudence Chamberlain, the focus of the fourth wave is justice for women in opposition to sexual harassment and violence against women. Its essence, she writes, is incredulity that certain attitudes can still exist. Fourth wave feminism is defined by technology, according to Kira Cochran, and is characterized particularly by the use of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Tumblr, and blogs such as Feministing to challenge misogyny and further gender equality. Issues that fourth wave feminists focus on include street and workplace harassment, campus sexual assault, and rape culture. Scandals including the harassment, abuse, and murder of women and girls have galvanized the movement. These have included the 2012 Delhi gang rape, 2012 Jimmy Savile allegations, the Bill Cosby allegations, 2014 Isla Vista killings, 2016 trial of Gian Gomisi, 2017 Harvey Weinstein allegations and subsequent Weinstein effect, and the 2017 Westminster sexual scandals. Examples of fourth wave feminist campaigns include the Everyday Sexism Project, No More Pages 3, Stop Bald Sexism, Mattress Performance, 10 Hours of Walking in New York City as a Woman, Hashtag Yes All Women, Free the Nipple, 1 Billion Rising, and the 2017 Women's March, the 2018 Women's March, and the Metoo Movement, Hashtag Metoo Movement. In December 2017, Time magazine shows several prominent female activists involved in the Metoo movement, dubbed the Silence Breakers, as Person of the Year. Post-Feminism. The term post-feminism used to describe a range of viewpoints reacting to feminism since the 1980s. While not being anti-feminist, post-feminists believe that women have achieved second-wave goals while being critical of third and fourth-wave feminist goals. The term was first used to describe a backlash against second-wave feminism, but is now a label for a wide range of theories that take critical approaches to previous feminist discourses and includes challenges to second-wave ideas. Other post-feminists say that feminism is no longer relevant to today's society. Amelia Jones has written that the post-feminist texts, which emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, portrayed second-wave feminism as a monolithic entity. Dorothy Chun described a blaming narrative under the feminist moniker, whose feminists are undermined for continuing to make demands for greater gender equality in a post-feminist society, where gender equality has already been achieved. According to Chun, many feminists have voiced disquiet about the ways in which rights and equality discourses are now used against them. Theory. Feminist theory is the extension of feminism in theoretical or philosophical fields. It encompasses work in a variety of disciplines, including anthropology, sociology, economics, women's studies, literary criticism, art history, psychoanalysis, and philosophy. Feminist theory aims to understand gender inequality and focuses on gender politics, power relations, and sexuality, while providing a critique of these social and political relations. Much of feminist theory also focuses on the promotion of women's rights and interests. Themes explored in feminist theory include discrimination, stereotyping, objectification, especially sexual objectification, oppression, and patriarchy. In the field of literary criticism, Elaine Showalter describes the development of feminist theory as having three phases. The first she calls the feminist critique, in which the feminist reader examines the ideologies behind literary phenomena. The second Showalter calls genocriticism, in which the woman is producer of textual meaning. The last phase she calls gender theory, in which the ideological inscription and the literary effects of the sex-gender system are explored. This was paralleled in the 1970s by French feminists who developed the concept of écriture féminine, which translates as female or feminine writing. Helene Sixos argues that writing and philosophy are phallocentric, and along with other French feminists such as Luce Irigaray, emphasize writing from the body as a subversive exercise. The work of Julia Kristevov, a feminist psychoanalyst and philosopher, and Baraka Ettinger, artist and psychoanalyst, has influenced feminist theory in general and feminist literary criticism in particular. However, as the scholar Elizabeth Wright points out, none of these French feminists align themselves with the feminist movement as it appears in the Anglophone world. More feminist theory, such as that of Lisa Lucille Owens, has concentrated on characterizing feminism as a universal emancipatory movement. Movements and ideologies. Many overlapping feminist movements and ideologies have developed over the years. Feminism is often divided into three main traditions called liberal, radical, and socialist Marxist feminism, sometimes known as the Big Three schools of feminist thought. Since the late 20th century, newer forms of feminism have also emerged. Some branches of feminism track the political leanings of the larger society to a greater or lesser degree, or focus on specific topics such as the environment. Liberal feminism. Liberal feminism, also known under other names such as reformist, mainstream, or historically as bourgeoisie feminism, arose from the 19th century first wave feminism and was historically linked to the 19th century liberalism and progressivism. While 19th century conservatives tended to oppose feminism as such, liberal feminism seeks equality of men and women through political and legal reform within a liberal democratic framework, without radically altering the structure of society. Liberal feminism works within the structure of mainstream society to integrate women into that structure. During the 19th and 20th centuries, liberal feminism focused especially on women's suffrage and access to education. Norwegian Supreme Court Justice and former president of the Liberal Norwegian Association of Women's Rights, Karen Maria Bruzelius, has described liberal feminism as a realistic, sober, practical feminism. Susan Wendell argues that liberal feminism is a historical tradition that grew out of liberalism, as can be seen very clearly in the work of such feminists as Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill. The feminists who took principles from that tradition have developed analyses and goals that go far beyond those in the 18th and 19th century liberal feminists. And many feminists with goals and strategies identified as liberal feminists reject major components of liberalism. In a modern or party political sense, she highlights equality and opportunity as a defining feature of liberal feminism. Liberal feminism is a very broad term that encompasses many, often diverging, modern branches and the variety of feminist and general political perspectives. Some historically liberal branches are equality feminism, social feminism, equity feminism, difference feminism, individualist and libertarian feminism, and some forms of state feminism, particularly the state feminism of the Nordic countries. The broad field of liberal feminism is sometimes confused with the more recent and smaller branch known as libertarian feminism, which tends to diverge significantly from mainstream liberal feminism. For example, libertarian feminism does not require social measures to reduce material inequality. In fact, it opposes such measures. In contrast, liberal feminism may support such requirements, and egalitarian versions of feminism insist on them. Catherine Rodenberg has criticized what she described as neoliberal feminism, saying it is individualized rather than collectivized, and becoming detached from social inequality. Due to this, she argues that liberal feminism cannot offer any sustained analysis of the structures of male dominance, power, or privilege. Some modern forms of feminism that historically grew out of the broader liberal tradition have more recently also been described as conservative in relative terms. This is particularly the case for libertarian feminism, which conceives of people as self-owners and therefore as entitled to freedom from coercive interference. Radical feminism. Radical feminism arose from the radical ring of the second wave feminism and calls for a radical reopening of society to eliminate male supremacy. A radical reordering of society to eliminate male supremacy. It considers the male-controlled capitalist hierarchy as the defining feature of women's oppression and total uprooting of and reconstruction of society as necessary. Separatist feminism does not support heterosexual relationships. Lesbian feminism is thus closely related. Other feminists criticize separatist feminism as sexist. Materialist ideologies. Rosemary Hennessy and Chris Ingram says the materialist forms of feminism grew out of Western Marxist thought and have inspired a number of different but overlapping movements, all of which are involved in the critique of capitalism and are focused on ideologies' relationship to women. Marxist feminism argues that capitalism is the root cause of women's oppression, and that the discrimination against women in domestic life and employment is an effect of capitalist ideologies. Socialist feminism distinguishes itself from Marxist feminism by arguing that women's liberation can be achieved by working to end both the economic and cultural sources of women's oppression. Anarcha-feminists believe that class struggle and anarchy against the state requires struggling against patriarchy, which comes from involuntary hierarchy. Other modern feminisms. Eco-Feminism. Eco-feminists see men's control of land as responsible for the oppression of women and destruction of the natural environment. Eco-feminism has been criticized for focusing too much on a mystical connection between women and nature. Black and post-colonial ideologies. Sarah Ahmed argues that black and post-colonial feminisms pose a challenge to some of the organizing premises of Western feminist thought. During much of its history, feminist movements and the theoretical developments, which were led predominantly by the middle class, white women from Western Europe and North America. However, women of other races have proposed alternative feminisms. This trend accelerated in the 1960s with the civil rights movement in the United States and the end of Western European colonialism in Africa, the Caribbean, parts of Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Since that time, women in developing nations and former colonies and who are of color of various ethnicities or living in poverty have proposed additional feminisms. Womanism emerged after early feminist movements were largely white and middle class. Post-colonial feminists argue that colonial oppression and Western feminism marginalized post-colonial women but did not turn them into passive or voiceless. Third-wave feminism and indigenous feminism are closely related to post-colonial feminism. These ideas are also correspond with ideas of African feminism, motherism, Stiwaism, Negro-feminism, femalism, transnational feminism, and Africana womanism. Social constructionist ideologies. In the late 20th century, various feminists began to argue that gender roles are socially constructed, that it is impossible to generalize women's experiences across cultures and histories. Post-structural feminism draws on the philosophies of post-structuralism and deconstruction in order to argue that the concept of gender is created socially and culturally through discourse. Postmodern feminists also emphasize that the social construction of gender and the discursive nature of reality. However, postmodern feminists also emphasize that social construction of gender and the discursive nature of reality. However, as Pamela Abbott writes, a postmodern approach to feminism highlights the existence of multiple truths rather than simply men and women's standpoints. Transgender people. Feminist views on transgender people differ. Some feminists do not view trans women as women, believing that they have male privilege due to their sex assignment at birth. Additionally, some feminists reject the concept of transgender identity due to views that all behavioral differences between genders are the result of socialization. In contrast, other feminists and trans feminists believe that the liberation of trans women is necessary part of feminist goals. Third wave feminists are overall more supportive of trans rights. A key concept of trans feminism is of the transmisogyny, which is irrational fear of aversion to or discrimination against transgender women or feminine gender non-conforming people. Cultural movements. Riot Girls took an anti-corporate stance of self-sufficiency and self-reliance. Riot Girls' emphasis on universal female identity and separatism often appear more closely aligned with second wave feminism than the third wave. The movement encouraged and made adolescent girls' standpoints central, allowing them to express themselves fully. Lipstick feminism is a cultural feminist movement that attempts to respond to the backlash of second wave radical feminists of the 1960s and 1970s by reclaiming symbols of feminine identity such as makeup, suggested clothing, and having sexual allure as valid and empowering personal choices. Demographics. According to a 2014 Ipsos poll covering 15 developed countries, 53% of respondents identified as feminist, and 87% agreed that women should be treated equally to men in all areas based on their competency, not their gender. It's funny, 53% of people say they're feminist, but 83% of people say that there should be equality. That means really 87% of people are feminists and 53% of people don't know what feminism is. That's just my opinion. Sorry. However, 55% of women agreed that they have full equality with men and the freedom to reach their full dreams and aspirations. Taken together, these studies reflect the importance differentiating between claiming feminist identity and holding feminist attitudes or beliefs. United States, according to a 2015 poll, 18% of Americans use the label of feminist to describe themselves. What? That's weird. While 85% are feminists in practice, as they reported to believe in equality for women, despite the popular belief in what feminism stands for. 52% do not identify as feminist, 26% were unsure, and 4% provided no response. Sociological research shows that in the U.S., increased educational attainment is associated with greater support for feminist issues. In addition, politically liberal people are more likely to support feminist ideas compared to those who are conservative. United Kingdom. According to numerous polls, 7% of Britons use the label feminist to describe themselves, while 83% being feminist in practice by saying they support equality of opportunity for women. This includes even higher support for men, 86%, than women, 81%. Sexuality. Feminist views of sexuality vary and have differed by historical period and by cultural context. Feminist attitudes to female sexuality have taken a few different directions. Matters such as the sex industry, sexual representation in the media, and issues regarding consent to sex under conditions of male dominance have been particularly controversial among feminists. This debate had culminated in the late 1970s and 1980s, what came to be known as the feminist sex wars, which pitted anti-pornography feminism against sex-positive feminism, and parts of the feminist movement were deeply divided by these debates. Feminists have taken a variety of positions on different aspects of the sexual revolution from the 1960s and 70s. Over the course of the 1970s, a large number of influential women accepted lesbian and bisexual women as part of feminism. Sex industry. Opinions on the sex industry are diverse. Feminists who are critical of the sex industry generally see it as the exploitative result of patriarchal social structures which reinforce sexual and cultural attitudes complicit in rape and sexual harassment. Alternately, feminists who support at least part of the sex industry argue that it can be a medium of feminist expression and means for women to take control of their sexuality. For the views of feminism on male prostitutes, see the article on male prostitution. Feminist views on pornography range from condemnation of pornography as a form of violence against women to an embracing of some forms of pornography as a medium of feminist expression. Similarity, feminist views of prostitution vary, ranging from critical to supportive. Affirming female sexual anomy. Affirming female sexual autonomy. For feminists, a woman's right to control her own sexuality is a key issue. Feminists such as Catherine McKinnon argue that women have very little control over their own bodies, with female sexuality being largely controlled and defined by men in patriarchal societies. Feminists argue that sexual violence committed by men is often rooted in ideologies of male sexual entitlement, and these systems grant women very few legitimate options to refuse sexual advances. Feminists argue that all cultures are, in one way or another, dominated by ideologies that largely deny women the right to decide how to express their sexuality, because men under patriarchy feel entitled to define sex on their own terms. This entitlement can take different forms, depending on the culture. In some conservative and religious cultures, marriage is regarded as an institution, which requires a wife to be sexually available at all times, virtually without limit. Thus, forcing or coercing sex on a wife is not considered a crime or even an abusive behavior. In more liberal cultures, this entitlement takes the form of general sexualization of the whole culture. This can be played out in the sexual objectification of women, with pornography and other forms of sexual entertainment creating the fantasy that all women exist solely for men's sexual pleasure, and that women are readily available and desiring to engage in sex at any time with any man on a man's terms. In 1968, feminist Anne Cote argued in her essay The Myth of the Vaginal Organism that women's biology and clitoral organism had not been properly analyzed and popularized, because men have organisms essentially by friction with the vagina and not the clitoral area. Science. Sandra Harding says that the moral and political insights of the women's movements have inspired social scientists and biologists to raise critical questions about the ways traditional researchers have explained gender, sex, and relations between social and natural worlds. Some feminists, such as Ruth Hubbard, Evelyn Fox Keller, criticize traditional scientific discourse as being historically biased towards male perspective. A part of the feminist research agenda is the examination of the ways in which power inequities are created or reinforced in scientific and academic institutions. Physicist Lisa Randall, appointed to a task force at Harvard by then-President Lawrence Summers after this controversial discussion of why women may be underrepresented in science and engineering, said, "I just want to see a whole bunch of more women enter the field so these issues don't have to come up anymore." Let me see how much is left here. Oh, there's a lot left. Well, maybe I'll read the rest of this some other time. Because I start to feel a little woozy when I read too much. Well, finish this section and then I'll do a part 2 maybe tomorrow or something, or maybe I'll do the rest of it, or see could I fit the rest of this. And yeah, I'll do a part 2. Well, half of this page is made up of references, but I'll do a part 2 where I finish this tomorrow. Sorry if this is incomplete, but the next video in this series should complete this Wikipedia article. I just gotta finish this section I'm in here, and then I'll... Wait, where was I? Sorry, I have bad eyes. I get lost when I'm reading something. Let me just finish this section and then I'll stop. Not that this is the complete meaning of feminism. This is only half of the thing, but you know what I mean. Lynn Harkinson Nelson writes that feminist empiricists find fundamental differences between the experiences of men and women. Thus, they seek to obtain knowledge through the examination of the experiences of women and to uncover the consequences of omitting, describing or devaluing them to account for a range of human experience. Another part of the feminist research agenda is the uncovering of ways which power inequities are created, reinforced in society, in scientific and academic institutions. Furthermore, despite calls for gender attention to be paid to structures of gender inequality, inequity in the academic literature, structural analysis of gender bias rarely appear in highly cited psychological journals, especially in the commonly studied areas of psychology and personality. One criticism of feminist epistemology is that it allows social and political values to influence its findings. Susan Hack also points out that feminist epistemology reinforces traditional stereotypes about women's thinking as intuitive and emotional. Mira Nanda further cautions that this may in fact trap women within traditional gender roles and help justify patriarchy. Biology and gender. Modern feminism challenges the essentialist view of gender as biologically intrinsic. For example, Anne Foster Sterling's book, The Myths of Gender, explores the assumptions embodied in scientific research that support a biologically essentialist view of gender. In Delusions of Gender, Cordelia Fine disputes scientific evidence that suggests that there is an innate biological differences between men's and women's minds, asserting instead that cultural and societal beliefs are the reason for differences between individuals and are commonly perceived as sex differences. Feminist Psychology. Feminism and psychology emerged as a critique of the dominant male outlook on psychological research where only male perspectives were studied with all male subjects. As women earned doctorates in psychology, females and their issues were introduced as legitimate topics of study. Feminist psychology emphasizes social context, lived experience, and qualitative analysis. Projects such as Psychology's Feminist Voices have emerged to catalog the influence of feminist psychologists on the discipline. The other half of this Wikipedia article talks about culture and other things like culture. I'll maybe read that tomorrow. If I feel like reading it tomorrow, I might read it tomorrow. But I just wanted to say I am a feminist personally, and I think it's important to educate yourself on these matters. That's why I'm reading this, because I want to be more educated on this material, and I want you to also be more educated. I want to promote these ideas. I want to promote feminism as much as possible. I want to talk about the issues that women face on a daily basis, because I think it's not talked about enough in today's world. So I am a feminist, and I think you should be too, because it's healthy. I think, what was I going to say? I think sometimes you might think you're not a good feminist, but you know the funny thing is, you don't always have to be a good feminist. Being a feminist to me is like being a Christian. I'm not saying it's a religion, but I'm saying you can believe in God without being a good Christian. You can believe in Jesus without being a good Christian. You don't have to be a good feminist. You can try to learn about it and expand your mind and listen to other people's perspectives instead of your own perspective. And the more you educate yourself about it, the more you might make better decisions, the more you might treat people more equitably. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. Anyways, thank you for... let me know in the comments below, what do you think of feminism? Are you a feminist? Let me know in the comments below. What do you think about the subject matter? Please subscribe to this channel, be part of the community. And please like this video. It really helps out the channel a lot. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Bye.